Welcome to part 28 of our series on building a Zelda-like game in Phaser 3. In this video, we'll set up camera bounds to keep our player within the correct areas of our level. We'll also implement door objects, which allow for seamless navigation between rooms and different sections of our dungeon. If you're new here, this is part of a full series where we create a Zelda-inspired game from scratch. Check out the playlist link in the description to start from the beginning. Alright, let's jump in and add camera controls and doors. Now that we have our collision logic in place, we'll start working on making some updates to our camera. Currently, our camera is set up to follow our player everywhere throughout our level, and so as our player gets closer to one of our walls, we prevent them from leaving, but our camera shows us what's outside of our dungeon. Instead, we want to lock our camera so it only shows us our current room that our player is in. Once our player leaves that room, we want to have our camera transition to follow our player, and then show the new room and then be bounded to that size. To start making these changes, we'll come back over to our game scene. Let's go to our method where we create our camera. So before we start having our camera follow our player, we want to define the area that our camera is allowed to move to and show in our game world. To do that, we can use the set bounds method on the camera to set the width and the height and the X and Y positioning of where our camera is allowed to move to. For those values, we're going to use our room objects that we created in Tiled to get the size of our room that our player is currently in. So let's do const, we'll do room size, we'll set that equal to our objects by room ID. Now we want to use our level data, and we want to grab our current room that the player's in. Then we grab our room object. Now we can do this, we'll do our cameras. We want to grab our main camera, we'll call set bounds. Our set bounds method expects us to provide a rectangle shape of where our camera can scroll to. So we'll need to provide our X and Y, so our starting values for that rectangle, and then our width and our height for that rectangle. So for our X position, this will be our room size.x. For our Y, we need to use our room size Y value, and then we'll need to subtract the height of our room size, since our Y position will be the bottom of our game object. Now we need to do our width and height, and so we can just rely on our room size.width and our room size.height from our object we created in Tiled. Oh, one quick fix, we want this to be room size.height, not Y again. Now when we save and refresh, we'll see that our camera is now bounded to our original room object that we created in Tiled, and our camera no longer follows our player around since we're within that bounds. As our player gets close to the edges of our wall, our camera doesn't move and show us outside our room. Next, for our cameras, we want to add in logic so once our player enters one of our doors, we'll have our camera transition from this current room view to our next room in our dungeon. To do this, we'll need to create a new game object type to represent our door from the doors we created in Tiled. Once our player collides with our door, our trigger for our door will then update our camera's position to follow our player, and we'll have our player animate from our current position to our next room. To start making these changes, let's go into our code, under our source folder, under our game objects, under objects, let's make a new object type, and we'll call this door. Alright, let's export out our class. We'll do export class, we'll do door. We're going to have this implement our custom game object. So for our door class, we're not going to extend one of our built-in Phaser game object types. Our door is actually going to consist of two. We're going to create a zone, so when our player overlaps with this zone game object, that will be our trigger to transition to our next room. And then we'll have an image game object that actually represents our door. So when our door is locked, or it's shut from a trap, or it's our boss door, we'll show a different texture depending on our door type. So now for our door class, we want to pass in our tiled object data, since this will have all of the information for where we're going to create our game object in our level. So let's add in our constructor. For a constructor, we'll need our phaser scene. Next, we'll expect our configuration object from tiled, so we'll call this config. For our type, we'll do our tiled door object, and then we'll want to know the ID of our room where this game object is located at. Now we'll define the properties on our door. These properties are going to align with our properties from our tiled door object that we created in Tiled. So we'll start with our phaser scene. Then we'll want to know our room ID that this door belongs to. And then for our door, we'll need to know which door this actually connects to and what room this connects to. So we'll do our target door ID. This will also be a number. Then we'll have our target room ID. We'll need our X and Y position where we want to position this at in our game. Then if our door transitions to a new level, we'll want to know the target level. This will be a string. Finally, we'll need a property to keep track of our zone game object, which will be our trigger for our door. For this, we'll call this door transition zone. For our type, this will be a phaser, our game objects, and a zone game object. Finally, we'll add in one more property. We'll call this debug door transition zone. For this type, this will be a phaser, our game objects, and it'll be a rectangle game object, or it can be undefined. Now that we have our properties, let's update these in our constructor. So for our scene, this will be equal to our scene. We'll have our room ID will be equal to the room that was provided. Now for our other properties, we want to grab this from our config. So we'll do our target door ID. This will be our config, our target door ID. Our target room ID will be our config, target room ID. Let's do our target level, be our config, target level. Now for X and Y. Now that we have our initial properties in our class, we need to create a game object that our player will be able to interact with, so when they collide with it, we'll transition to our next room. For this, we don't want this game object to be visible in our scene, but we still want our player's body to be able to overlap with it. For this, we'll be making use of the phaser zone game object, and this is basically our rectangle that we can add to our game that won't be visible. So now adding that game object, we'll do this, we'll do our door transition zone, we'll do this, our scene, we want to do add, we'll do a zone game object. Since it's a rectangle, we need our X and Y and then our width and height. So we'll grab those from our config. So we'll have our config.x, config.y, config width, and then config height. For our game object, we want to update our zone. So we'll do set origin, and we'll do 0 and 1. And now we're going to set the name property on our zone game object. So we'll do our config, our ID. We want to do this to string. So for our zone game object, we're setting our name property equal to our door ID. The reason we're doing that is we need a way to associate this game object with our parent game object here for our door. And so when we go to add our collisions, we'll want to be able to check for collisions between our player and this transition zone. Our main door class won't actually have a physics body, and so we won't be able to check for collisions between our player and this door. And so once our player collides with that game object, we can then use that name property to find our door from our game scene. And so now that we have our zone game object, in order to help us debug this, we're going to add another rectangle to our scene since our zone game object is not visible. For this, we're going to use that debug door transition zone property, and we'll set it equal to our scene. We want to do add. We want to add a rectangle. And now for our rectangle, we want to use the same width and height and the same positioning as our door transition zone. So we'll just reference our door transition zone, and we'll grab our X, our Y, and then our width and our height. And to make sure it's in the same position, we want to set the same origin, and do set origin, and we'll do 0, 1. Oh, and then for our rectangle, we actually need our color, so we'll do 0, X, FF, FF, 0, 0. And we'll do 0.6 for our alpha. And so to keep our code consistent, let's update our scene reference. We'll do this, and we'll reference our scene. Finally, for our zone game object, in order for our player to actually be able to collide with it, we need to enable physics for it and give it a body. So after we create our door transition zone, we want to do this. We'll reference our scene. We'll grab physics. We'll do world. We'll do enable. And now we want to provide our game object. And now this will give it an arcade physics body based on our size that we set here. Now that we created our two game objects, next for our class, we're going to add some getters to retrieve our properties that we defined up here. And since we're implementing our custom game object, we need to add our two methods for enabling and disabling our object. For these, let's open up our pot class. I'm going to copy our two methods for disable object, enable object. Paste those public methods onto our door class. So for our disable object method, we just want to disable our physics body on our door transition zone. So we'll do this, we'll do our door transition zone. We want to grab our physics body. So we're going to do as, our phaser, our physics, our arcade, our body for our type. And now we'll do enable, and we'll set this to be false. And now we want to make our game object not active. And so we'll do our door transition zone. We'll set active, and we'll set that to be false. Now for enabling our object, we just want to do the inverse. So let's paste that. We'll set enable to be true, and we'll set active to be true. Now for our getters, we just want to add a getter for each of these properties here. So let's do get X. This will return a number. So it'll return this, and then our X property. Let's copy that. We'll paste it a few times. So now we'll get our Y property. We'll get our room ID. Then we'll get our target room ID. Then we'll get our target door ID. And now we want to be able to return a door transition zone game object. So I'm just going to copy our property name. Let's paste that. Our return type will be our phaser, our game object, our zone. And then for our last getter, we want to grab our target level, and so we'll do our target level. Now this will be a string, and so we'll return this and our target level. All right, and then for our door class, we just need to add in one more property. One of the properties we didn't bring in from our config is the direction that we set up in tiled. For that, let's add in our direction property to our class. This will be typed to our direction. And after we set our X and Y, we'll just do this. We'll do our direction. We're going to set that equal to our config and then our direction. Now let's just add in a getter to get that value. We'll paste that in. So we'll get in our direction. Then we'll return our direction property, and let's add in our type. Now that we have our base logic in place for our door class, we can start creating instances of our door in our game scene. Let's jump back over to our game scene, and we'll start by adding a few new properties to our class. First, we want to add a property to keep track of our current room ID, so as our player is navigating through our level, we'll know which room the player is currently in. So for that, we'll add a private property. We're going to call this current room ID. This will be a number. Next, we'll need to create a phaser group to keep track of all of our transition door game objects. That way we'll be able to add in our collision between our player and these game objects. For that, we'll call that a door transition group. So we'll do a phaser, our game objects, and then our group. So next, let's go down to our init method. Let's start off by setting our current room ID equal to our data and the room ID that's provided. Next, for our objects by room ID, let's update our property for our doors, and we'll do our door class type. We'll also do the same thing for our door map. Now, let's jump down to our create doors method. So for our create doors method, let's get rid of our console log. And after we have our valid game objects, now we want to loop through those and create our door instances. So we'll do our valid tiled objects. We'll do for each. Now for each of our tiled objects, we want to create an instance of our door. So we're going to do const. We'll do door will be equal to a new door instance. We want to pass in our scene, our tiled object, and then our current room ID we're processing. Now we want to store a reference to this door in our objects by room ID map and our doors array. So we'll do this. We'll do our objects by room ID. We'll use the provided room ID. For our doors array, let's do push. And we'll push in our door instance. Now I'm going to copy this. We'll paste it. But instead of doing doors, we want to do our door map. And now for our door map, for our object, we want to do our tiled object and then our ID for our door. And instead of calling push, we'll just set it equal to our door instance. Lastly, we just want to add that door transition game object to our group. So we'll do this. We'll do our door transition group. Let's do add, and we want to do our door. And then we'll do our door transition zone. All right, so if we save, it looks like we have an issue. Yes, we actually need to create an instance of our phaser group to assign to our property. Let's go up to our create level method. So down where we initialize our objects, we'll do this. We'll do our door transition group. We're going to set equal to this. We'll do add, and now we want to do group. And we can pass in an empty array for our initial game objects. All right, so when we save and refresh, we should now see this new yellow rectangle show up in our scene. And so that rectangle represents our zone game object for our player to interact with. So now that our game objects are available in our scene, now we just need to add in our collisions between our player and this game object. So now to add in that collider, let's go to our register colliders method. We'll come to our logic where we add in our colliders between our player and our other game objects. Now let's add in our new collision. So we'll do this, we'll do our physics, let's do add. For this we want to do an overlap instead of a collider, and we're going to reference our player. And now we want to do our door transition group. So now for our callback, we'll want our player object, and then we want our door object. So now we'll call a new method, and we'll call this handle room transition. And then when we call this method, we'll pass in our door object. Now for our door object, we'll add in our type. So we're going to do as, our phaser, our types, our physics, and now we'll do our arcade physics, and we'll do a game object with body. Now we just need to define this new method on our class. So let's come down to the bottom of our file. We'll add in our new private method. Now for our argument, we're going to call this door trigger. We'll want to do the same type that we defined above. And so we'll have our phaser, our types, our physics arcade, and then our game object with body. And for our method, we won't return anything. And right now we'll just do console.log, and we want to log out our door trigger. And we'll do our door trigger.name. Alright, so when we save, we come back to our game. Now, if we have our player overlap with our yellow rectangle, we'll see right away we start logging a message about which door ID our player is currently overlapping with. Nice. That's it for this part of the series. If you found this helpful, be sure to hit the like button. It really helps out the channel. And if you're following along, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. If you have any questions or want to share your progress, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Alright, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.